The Psychology of Evil. Prologue. The question that haunts us. There is a question that follows us through life like a shadow. It sits beneath the surface of dinner-table conversations about the news. It lingers in the silence after a film about a serial killer. It whispers when we read about genocide, terrorism, or the casual cruelty of a bully. It rises unbidden in the middle of the night, when we are alone with our thoughts and the world feels fragile. The question is this: what makes a person do evil? Not what is evil. That is a philosopher's puzzle. Not how do we stop it? That is a policymaker's problem. The question that claws at us, that refuses to let go, is more intimate, more unnerving. Could I do it? Could I, under the right circumstances, betray a friend, torture a stranger, watch suffering and do nothing, walk past a beggar, ignore a cry for help, justify a small cruelty in the name of a larger good? We want to believe the answer is no. We want to believe that we are fundamentally good, that evil is something other people do: monsters, psychopaths, tyrants, the broken and the damned. We draw a bright line between us and them, and we sleep soundly on our side of it. But the evidence of history and the evidence of science tells a different story. The line is not bright. It is a shifting threshold, a place of constant negotiation. And we are all, at every moment, standing on one side of it or the other, sometimes without even knowing. This book is an exploration of that threshold. It is a journey into the darkness of human nature, not to be consumed by it, but to map its contours. It draws on philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, history, culture, and theology, not as abstract disciplines, but as living resources for understanding who we are and who we might become. It is not a comfortable journey. It will ask you to confront things you would rather avoid. It will challenge your assumptions about yourself and others. It will not give you easy answers, because there are none. But it will give you something more valuable, a way of seeing, a framework for understanding the forces that shape human behavior, and a map for navigating the moral terrain that we all must traverse. Because the question of evil is not just an academic question. It is the question of our time and of all time, and how we answer it, not in words but in actions, will determine the kind of world we leave to those who come after us. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Basement Stanford and the Power of Situation. In the summer of 1971, a young Stanford psychology professor named Philip Zimbardo built a prison in the basement of a university building. It was not a real prison, of course. It was an experiment. Zimbardo had recruited 24 healthy, emotionally stable college students through a newspaper advertisement. They had been screened for psychological problems and criminal histories. They were, by all accounts, ordinary young men from good families. Half were randomly assigned to be guards. The other half were assigned to be prisoners. The guards were given uniforms, sunglasses, and billy clubs. The prisoners were given smocks, ID numbers, and nylon caps to simulate shaved heads. The experiment was scheduled to last 2 weeks. It was terminated after 6 days. What happened in that basement has become one of the most famous and disturbing studies in the history of psychology. But the full story, the story of what those young men became and what it reveals about human nature, is more unsettling than the headlines suggest. On the very first day, the guards began to assert their authority. They woke the prisoners at dawn, forced them to do push-ups, and subjected them to humiliating inspections. By the second day, the prisoners were in a state of passive rebellion. They blocked their cell doors with their beds, refusing to cooperate. The guards responded by stripping them naked, confiscating their mattresses, and forcing them to sleep on concrete. By the third day, the prisoners were showing signs of severe psychological distress. One prisoner, who had been on a hunger strike, was forced to soil himself and then berated by the guards for being filthy. Another began to sob uncontrollably. A third was placed in solitary confinement for hours. By the fifth day, 5 prisoners had been released early due to extreme emotional reactions. The remaining prisoners were docile, withdrawn, and deeply depressed. They had internalized their roles so completely that they no longer saw themselves as students in an experiment. They were prisoners, and the guards were their tormentors. The guards, meanwhile, had become sadistic. They delighted in their power. They invented cruel punishments for minor infractions. They mocked, humiliated, and dehumanized their charges. Some of them later admitted that they had enjoyed it. What happened in that basement was not the work of monsters. These were ordinary young men from good families, with no history of violence or mental illness. They became what the situation allowed them to become. Zimbardo called this the Lucifer effect, the transformation of good people into agents of evil, and his conclusion was devastating. It does not take a psychopath to commit atrocities. It takes a situation that systematically erodes empathy, rewards obedience, and dehumanizes the other. The Stanford Prison Experiment is not an isolated example. It is a microcosm of a larger pattern that has repeated itself throughout history in Nazi Germany, in Rwanda, in Abu Ghraib, in countless other settings where ordinary people have been led to do terrible things. The situation matters. It matters more than we want to believe. But the Stanford experiment also offers a glimpse of something else, the possibility of resistance. One of the guards in the experiment refused to participate in the cruelty. He would not humiliate the prisoners. He would not enforce arbitrary punishments. He went along with the superficial demands of his role, but he refused to cross the line into sadism. When Zimbardo asked him why, he said simply, "It felt wrong." This guard was not a hero in any dramatic sense. He did not stage a rebellion. He did not expose the experiment. He simply refused to participate in evil. And his refusal was enough to prove that even in the most corrupting situations, choice remains. Zimbardo himself later admitted that he was not immune to the corrupting power of the experiment. He became so absorbed in his role as superintendent that he lost perspective. It was only when a colleague, a young psychologist named Christina Maslach, visited the experiment and expressed her horror that Zimbardo was jolted into awareness. She was the one who told him to end it. The Stanford Prison Experiment is a parable about the power of the situation. But it is also a parable about the power of the individual, the power to see clearly, to refuse, to speak truth, to resist. And that is the paradox at the heart of this inquiry. We are the only creature capable of both Auschwitz and the Underground Railroad, both genocide and the Geneva Convention, both torture and the Hippocratic Oath. We contain multitudes. And the question of which side wins is never settled once and for all. It is settled in each moment, in each choice, in each situation. Chapter 2: The Ghost in the Skull, Neuroscience and the Moral Brain. The Stanford Prison Experiment revealed something profound about human nature, that ordinary people placed in the right situation can become agents of cruelty, but it did not explain how that transformation happens at the level of the brain. To understand that, we must go inside the skull into the 3-pound organ that is the most complex object in the known universe. The brain is the seat of everything we are, our thoughts, our emotions, our desires, our fears, and our moral judgments. Every choice we make, every flicker of empathy or flash of anger, every moment of self-control or surrender to impulse is mediated by neurons firing in specific circuits, chemicals flooding specific synapses, structures lighting up in specific patterns. Neuroscience does not reduce morality to biology. It does not say that we are nothing but our brain chemistry. But it does reveal something that philosophy alone cannot: the physical reality of our moral lives. And here is the first uncomfortable truth that neuroscience hands us. Your brain is not a single unified self. It is a committee, and the committee argues. Let me introduce you to a few members of that committee. First, there is the amygdala, two almond-shaped clusters deep in the temporal lobes. They are your brain's early warning system. They process fear, threat, and emotional salience. When you see a face twisted in rage or hear a cry of pain, your amygdala responds before you are consciously aware of what you've perceived. It is fast, instinctive, and profoundly ancient. We share it with reptiles. The amygdala is not evil. It is protective. It alerts you to danger and mobilizes your body to respond. But it can also be hijacked by fear, by prejudice, by the perception of threat in a face that is merely different. When the amygdala is overactive, we become reactive, defensive, and quick to judge. When it is underactive, we become reckless, indifferent to risk, and blind to the suffering of others. Then there is the prefrontal cortex, the evolutionary newcomer, the part of the brain that sits just behind your forehead. This is the seat of reason, planning, self-control, and moral deliberation. It is slower than the amygdala but more nuanced. It can override fear, delay gratification, and weigh consequences. It is the part of you that says, "Wait, let's think about this." The prefrontal cortex is the brain's brake pedal. It inhibits impulsive reactions and allows us to consider the long-term effects of our actions. But it is also the part of the brain that is most easily exhausted, most vulnerable to stress, and most susceptible to the distortions of rationalization. When it is weakened by fatigue, by alcohol, by the pressure of the moment, the amygdala takes over. And then there is the mirror neuron system, a network of cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you see someone else perform that same action. When you watch someone smile, your mirror neurons simulate a smile. When you see someone in pain, your brain simulates that pain. This is the biological foundation of empathy. Not a metaphor, but a physical resonance between your nervous system and another's. Mirror neurons are the reason we flinch when we see someone get hurt. They are the reason we feel joy when we see someone succeed. They are the reason we can understand the emotions of others, not by thinking about them, but by feeling them, viscerally, in our own bodies. These three systems, fear, reason, empathy, are constantly in conversation, and the outcome of that conversation determines whether you reach out to help or turn away, whether you obey an unjust order or refuse, whether you see a fellow human being or an obstacle. The trouble is that conversation is not always balanced. Consider psychopathy not the caricature of the Hollywood serial killer, but the clinical reality. Psychopathy is characterized by shallow emotions, impulsivity, grandiosity, and a striking lack of empathy. And when neuroscientists scan the brains of individuals with psychopathic traits, they find something consistent: reduced activity in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, and diminished connectivity between them. In other words, the parts of the brain that process fear and moral reasoning are underactive. The alarm system is quiet. The brake pedal is loose. The mirror neurons that would normally simulate another's pain are silent. This does not mean that every psychopath becomes a criminal. Many function as CEOs, lawyers, surgeons, or politicians. But it does mean that their moral landscape is fundamentally different from yours or mine. They do not feel what we feel. They do not experience the visceral pull of another's suffering. They know intellectually that an action is wrong, but they do not feel it emotionally. And that gap between knowing and feeling may be the most dangerous gap of all. But psychopaths are rare. The vast majority of evil is not committed by people who lack empathy. It is committed by people who turn it off. This is where the neuroscience becomes truly chilling. In experiments using functional MRI, Participants are shown images of people in pain burns, mutilations, injuries. The amygdala and the insula, another empathy-related region, light up. But when participants are told that the person in pain deserves it because they are a terrorist, a criminal, a member of an outgroup, those same brain regions show reduced activation. The empathy is suppressed. What this means is staggering. Dehumanization is not just a metaphor, it is a neural process. When we categorize others as them rather than us, our brains literally respond differently to their suffering. We feel less, and feeling less makes it easier to inflict pain. This is not a failure of individual morality. It is a feature of how our brains are wired. We evolved in tribes, and our empathy evolved to be selective potent for kin and allies, diminished for strangers and enemies. In the modern world, with its weapons of mass destruction and systemic injustices, that ancient wiring becomes a liability. But there is another piece of the puzzle, and it is perhaps the most hopeful one: neuroplasticity. The brain is not fixed, it changes with experience. Empathy can be cultivated through meditation, through exposure to diverse others, through education, through relationships. The circuits of self-control can be strengthened. The committee can learn to work together. And this means that evil is not destiny. If the brain can be shaped toward cruelty, it can also be shaped toward compassion. If situations can suppress empathy, other situations can amplify it. Let me give you a concrete example. In one study, researchers asked participants to administer electric shocks to another participant who was actually an actor. Some participants were told to look at the actor's face. Others were told to look at their hands. A third group was told to focus on the actor's emotional expression. The results were stark. Those who focused on the face, and especially those who focused on the emotional expression, delivered significantly milder shocks than those who focused on the hands. The act of seeing the other as a person activated the neural circuits of empathy and inhibited the circuits of aggression. This is why dehumanization is always accompanied by language that erases personhood. Cockroaches, rats, animals, vermin. It is not just rhetoric. It is a neural strategy, a way of turning off the empathy that would otherwise make violence unbearable. And if that is true, then the reverse is also true. The first step toward resisting evil is to see the humanity in the other. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a brain that is not a moral compass, but a moral terrain, a landscape of peaks and valleys, predispositions and possibilities. Some of us are born on more difficult terrain with weaker empathy circuits, stronger threat responses, more impulsive wiring. But none of us are determined by that terrain. We have the capacity to cultivate different pathways. We have the capacity to build environments that strengthen our better angels. We have the capacity to choose, again and again, to see the face rather than the hands. The biology of evil is real, but so is the biology of goodness. Chapter 3. The Making of a Conscious Attachment, Childhood and the Roots of Morality. We have seen the power of situation. We have mapped the neural terrain of empathy and cruelty. But those situations and those neural circuits do not emerge from nowhere. They are shaped from the very beginning of life by forces that are older than any experiment, older than any brain scan. A conscience is not born, it is made. And the making begins in the quiet, unremarkable moments of infancy, in the gaze of a parent, in the warmth of the embrace, in the thousands of small exchanges that teach a child what it means to be loved, what it means to be safe, and what it means to be human. In the 1960s, a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby began to study children who had been separated from their parents during the Second World War. He noticed something haunting. These children, though physically healthy, often failed to form normal emotional bonds. They were withdrawn, anxious, or strangely indifferent. They seemed to have lost something essential, something that Bowlby came to call attachment. Bowlby's insight was simple and profound. Human beings are born with an innate need to form a secure bond with a primary caregiver. This bond is not a luxury, it is a biological necessity, as essential as food or sleep. The infant cries, and the caregiver responds. The infant reaches out, and the caregiver holds. Through thousands of these small exchanges, the child builds an internal model of what relationships are, what trust feels like, and whether the world is safe. That internal model becomes the blueprint for every relationship that follows, including the relationship with the moral self. Let me show you what I mean. Psychologists have identified 4 primary attachment styles in children, which often persist into adulthood. Secure attachment. The child trusts that the caregiver will return, respond, and protect. The child explores the world with confidence, knowing there is a safe harbor. As an adult, they tend to form healthy relationships, trust others, and regulate their emotions effectively. Anxious attachment. The child is uncertain. The caregiver's response is inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes cold. The child clings, then resists, then clings again. As an adult, they often fear abandonment, seek constant reassurance, and struggle with emotional regulation. Avoidant attachment. The child learns that the caregiver is emotionally unavailable. The child stops seeking comfort, becomes self-reliant, and suppresses emotional needs. As an adult, they often keep others at a distance, distrust intimacy, and may lack empathy. Disorganized attachment. The child experiences fear, abuse, or neglect. The caregiver is both a source of comfort and a source of threat. The child is confused, dissociated, and unpredictable. As an adult, they often struggle with severe emotional dysregulation, dissociation, and relationships marked by chaos. Now, here is the chilling part. Attachment style is a powerful predictor of moral development. Children with secure attachments tend to develop healthy consciences. They internalize their parents' moral values, not out of fear, but out of love. They want to please the people who care for them. They learn empathy because they have experienced it. They learn trust because they have been trusted. They learn that the world is a place where goodness is possible, because goodness has been shown to them. But children with insecure or disorganized attachments develop something different, a fragile, defensive, or even absent conscience. They learn that the world is unpredictable. They learn that others cannot be relied upon. They learn that emotional connection is a risk, not a reward. And when they are asked to care for others, they may simply not know how because they have never truly been cared for themselves. This is not a condemnation of these children. It is a tragedy. They were not born lacking a conscience. They were born into circumstances that failed to build one. But attachment is only the beginning. There is another process at work in the making of a conscience: internalization. This is the slow, invisible process by which the child absorbs the values, rules, and judgments of the world around them and makes them their own. At first, the child behaves well because they fear punishment. They do not steal the cookie because they do not want to be caught. This is the stage of external morality, behavior regulated by fear of consequence. But over time, if the environment is right, that external regulation becomes internal. The child stops stealing the cookie not because they might be punished, but because it feels wrong. They have internalized the rule. They have made it their own. They now have a conscience, an inner voice that whispers, "This is not who I am." That inner voice is one of the most fragile and precious things in human life. It is forged in the crucible of love, consistency, and gentle guidance. It is not the product of harsh punishment. In fact, punishment often undermines internalization, replacing inner conviction with outer compliance. The child who obeys only out of fear does not develop a conscience. They develop a strategy. And strategies can be abandoned when the threat is gone. So what happens when this process goes wrong? We see it in the clinical picture of antisocial personality disorder, the diagnosis that often underlies the most troubling forms of human cruelty. Individuals with this condition are characterized by a pervasive disregard for the rights of others, a lack of empathy, a tendency toward manipulation and deceit, and an apparent absence of remorse or guilt. Not all are violent. Many are charming, intelligent, and successful. But beneath the surface there is a void where a conscience should be. The causes of antisocial personality disorder are complex, a tangled web of genetics, brain chemistry, and environment. But one thread runs consistently through the research: early trauma, neglect, and inconsistent or harsh parenting. These children did not receive the secure attachment and loving guidance that allows a conscience to take root. Instead, they learned that the world is hostile, that power is the only currency, and that other people are either tools or obstacles. Is this their fault? No. Is it their destiny? Not entirely. Some individuals with these backgrounds do go on to develop moral sensibilities through later relationships, therapy, or life-changing experiences. But the trajectory is harder, the odds steeper, and the fall more devastating when it comes. And yet, I want to be careful here, because the story I have just told, the story of attachment, internalization, and the making of a conscience, is only one side of the coin. It explains vulnerability. It does not explain evil. Most people who commit terrible acts are not psychopaths. They are not products of severe neglect. They are ordinary people with ordinary childhoods, ordinary attachments, and ordinary consciences. And yet, under certain circumstances, they betray those consciences not because they lack them, but because they have found ways to silence them. That is a different kind of story, the story of how good people do bad things without feeling bad about them. And it is to that story that we will turn next. Chapter 4: The Art of Silencing the Conscience, Moral Disengagement. We have traced the roots of conscience. We have seen how it is forged in the crucible of attachment, how it grows through internalization, how it can be fractured by neglect or abuse. But here is the question that haunts me, the question that should haunt all of us. If most people have a conscience, how do so many people commit evil anyway? This is not a question about psychopaths. It is not a question about monsters. It is a question about you and me and the ordinary people who carried out the Rwandan genocide, who participated in the My Lai massacre, who turned a blind eye to the suffering of their neighbors under Stalin or Hitler or Pinochet. These people were not born without consciences. They were not products of severe trauma or brain damage. They were, in the main, ordinary people with ordinary moral wiring, and they found ways to turn it off. A psychologist named Albert Bandura spent decades studying this phenomenon. He called it moral disengagement, the process by which individuals selectively suspend their moral standards to avoid the discomfort of self-condemnation. Bandura identified 8 mechanisms of moral disengagement. I want to walk through them with you because understanding them is one of the most powerful tools we have for resisting evil both in ourselves and in the world around us. 1. Moral justification. This is the most common mechanism and perhaps the most insidious. It works like this. You reframe a harmful act as serving a higher purpose. The torture of a prisoner becomes enhanced interrogation. The bombing of civilians becomes collateral damage. The execution of a rival becomes justice. The language shifts, the moral weight shifts, and suddenly an act that would have been unthinkable becomes not just permissible, but necessary. The ends justify the means is not just a cliché. It is a neural bypass, a way of telling your conscience to sit down and be quiet, because you are doing God's work, or history's work, or the nation's work. 2. Euphemistic labeling. This is the language of moral evasion. The CYA does not torture. It uses enhanced interrogation techniques. The military does not kill civilians, so it causes collateral damage. Corporations do not lay off employees. They downsize or restructure. Euphemisms are not just polite words. They are disguises. They strip the emotional content from an act, making it abstract, technical, and easier to stomach. A soldier who hears neutralizing the target feels less than one who hears killing a person. Language is not neutral. It is the vessel of our morality, and when we drain it of meaning, we drain our conscience along with it. 3. Advantageous comparison. This mechanism works by comparing a harmful act to something worse. Sure, we waterboarded him, but at least we didn't cut off his fingers like they do in other countries. Yes, we dropped bombs on that city, but the other side uses chemical weapons. This is the logic of the lesser evil, a logic that often serves as a gateway to greater evils. By comparing ourselves to the worst, we make ourselves feel better. We lower the bar, and once the bar is lowered, it is easier to lower it again. 4. Displacement of responsibility. This is the mechanism that made the Milgram experiment famous. Participants continued to deliver lethal shocks because they believed they were not responsible. The experimenter was. I was just following orders. My superiors made me do it. The system requires it. Displacement of responsibility is a way of handing over your conscience to someone else. It is the abdication of moral agency, and it is one of the most effective ways to make ordinary people commit atrocities. In the Holocaust, Eichmann was not a monster. He was a bureaucrat, a man who claimed he was just following orders. Arendt called it the banality of evil, the terrifying ordinariness of a man who had outsourced his moral compass to a system. 5. Diffusion of responsibility. This is displacement of responsibility scaled up. When responsibility is shared by a group, it dissolves. Everyone assumes someone else will speak up. Everyone assumes the decision was made collectively, so no single individual bears the weight. This is why committees can make decisions that individuals would never make alone. It is why mobs do things that individuals would never do. The conscience is diluted, the guilt is distributed, and when everyone is responsible, no one is. 6. Disregard or distortion of consequences. This mechanism involves minimizing or ignoring the harm caused by an action. They didn't feel anything. It was quick. They're better off this way. Sometimes this is active denial, sometimes it is simply not looking. The soldier who refuses to see the faces of the enemy. The executive who never visits the factories where the products are made. The citizen who scrolls past the images of suffering. The German sociologist Ulrich Beck called this organized irresponsibility. Systems designed to make consequences so abstract that no one can be held to account. The chain of command is so long, the supply chain so complex, that the connection between act and effect becomes invisible. And when you can't see the effect, you can't feel the guilt. 7. Dehumanization. We touched on this in Chapter 2, but it deserves its own moment. Dehumanization is the process of stripping others of their humanity, seeing them as less than human, as animals, as vermin, as abstract threats rather than living, breathing, suffering beings. Dehumanization works because our empathy is not automatic. It requires recognition. When we stop recognizing the other as one of us, the neural circuits of empathy go quiet. The suffering becomes abstract, and the moral brakes are released, history is littered with the language of dehumanization. Cockroaches in Rwanda, rats in Nazi propaganda, subhumans in colonial rhetoric. The words are never incidental. They are a necessary prelude to violence. 8. Attribution of blame. The final mechanism is blaming the victim. They deserved it. They started it. They brought it on themselves. By assigning responsibility to the person who suffers, we absolve ourselves of the need to feel guilt. This is why rape victims are asked what they were wearing. It is why the poor are blamed for their poverty. It is why victims of genocide are described as threats to security. If they are responsible, we are off the hook. Attribution of blame is a deep psychological need, the need to believe that the world is just, that bad things happen to bad people, that we are safe because we are good. But it is also a mechanism of evil because it allows us to look at suffering and feel nothing but reassurance. Now, let me tell you what these 8 mechanisms mean in practice. They are not just abstract categories. They are tools that have been used to justify slavery, genocide, torture, colonialism, domestic violence, and every other form of human cruelty. But here is the crucial point. They are not inevitable. They are choices, sometimes conscious choices, sometimes unconscious, but choices nonetheless. And understanding them is the first step to disarming them. Because when you know how your conscience is being silenced, you can refuse to participate. You can say, no, this is not justice, this is torture. You can say, no, this is not collateral damage. These are children. You can say, no, I will not follow that order. You can say, no, I will not turn away. I will look, and I will act. But here is the question that arises from all this. If moral disengagement is so effective, if we are all vulnerable to these mechanisms, is there any hope? Are we all just one situation away from becoming perpetrators? The answer is no. Not because we are immune, but because we are not helpless. Because there are also mechanisms of moral engagement, practices that strengthen the conscience, that make it harder to silence, that build resistance. And it is to that resistance, to the psychology of courage, compassion, and moral defiance that we will turn in the final chapters of this book. Chapter 5: The Psychopath Among Us. We have explored the mechanisms that make evil possible, the situations that corrupt, the neural circuits that silence empathy, the childhood fractures that weaken conscience, the mental tricks that allow ordinary people to do terrible things. But there is a shadow that hangs over all of this, a question that lingers unspoken in the margins of every discussion about evil. What about the ones who are born that way? Not the ones who were corrupted by circumstance, not the ones who silenced their conscience in a moment of weakness, not the ones who were following orders, but the ones who never had a conscience to silence in the first place, the ones who walk among us, charming and intelligent, but hollow at the core, the ones who feel no guilt, no remorse, no genuine attachment to others. The ones for whom other people are not fellow beings, but objects, tools to be used, obstacles to be removed, or sources of amusement to be toyed with. We call them by many names: psychopaths, sociopaths, narcissists, sadists. And they represent something deeply unsettling, the possibility that some forms of evil are not learned, but innate, not a failure of morality, but an absence of it. Let us begin with the one that haunts our collective imagination: psychopathy. In the clinical literature, psychopathy is characterized by a constellation of traits that fall into 2 broad categories. The first is interpersonal affective, glibness, superficial charm, grandiosity, pathological lying, manipulation, and a striking lack of empathy or remorse. The second is behavioral impulsivity, irresponsibility, need for stimulation, and early behavioral problems. The standard tool for measuring these traits is the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, a 20-item scale that rates individuals on a 40-point spectrum. Most people score below 5. A typical criminal scores around 20. A score of 30 or above is considered psychopathic. But here is what makes psychopathy truly unsettling. The brain differences are measurable. As I mentioned in Chapter 2, individuals with high psychopathy scores show reduced activity in the amygdala, the fear and emotion center, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with moral reasoning and decision-making. They also show reduced connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, meaning that the emotional warning signals do not reach the reasoning centers. In other words, the alarm system is broken. The visceral pull of another's suffering does not register. The dread of consequences does not take hold. This is not a choice. It is a neural reality. And it means that for some individuals, morality is not a matter of silencing their conscience. It is a matter of never having one in the first place. Now, I want to pause here and address something important. The word psychopath conjures images of serial killers and monsters. And it is true that some serial killers, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Dennis Rader, fit the profile. But the vast majority of individuals with psychopathic traits are not violent criminals. They are your colleagues, your neighbors, your bosses. Some researchers have estimated that as many as 1% of the general population and 3 to 4% of corporate leaders meet the criteria for psychopathy. These are the successful psychopaths. Individuals who channel their lack of empathy, their grandiosity, and their manipulative skills into careers in business, law, politics, and medicine. They are the ones who climb the corporate ladder without regard for those they step on. The charismatic leaders who inspire devotion while treating their followers as tools. The surgeons who save lives but lack any emotional connection to their patients. The lawyers who win cases by exploiting every weakness with no regard for truth or justice. They are not monsters. They are people. People who are missing something essential and who cause enormous harm, not through violence, but through callousness, exploitation, and the slow erosion of trust. Let me tell you a story that illustrates this. In the 1980s, a young man named James Fallon, a neuroscientist, was studying the brains of psychopathic criminals. He was looking for patterns, for structural differences that might explain their behavior. As part of his research, he scanned his own brain and was shocked to discover that his brain pattern matched the pattern he had been seeing in psychopaths. He had the reduced amygdala activity. He had the diminished connectivity. He had the neural signature of a psychopath. But Fallon was not a criminal. He was a successful scientist, a husband, a father, a functioning member of society. He had not committed violent acts. He had not exploited or manipulated others in any significant way. What made the difference? Fallon came to believe that it was his upbringing. He had been raised in a loving, supportive family. He had experienced secure attachment. He had internalized moral values. His brain was wired for psychopathy, but his environment had built a compensatory structure that prevented him from becoming a predator. This is a crucial point. Biology is not destiny. The psychopathic brain is a vulnerability, not a guarantee. It predisposes, but it does not determine. The presence of psychopathic traits does not mean that someone will become a perpetrator of evil. It means they are at greater risk, and that they require greater support to develop the moral scaffolding that others develop naturally. But it also means that we cannot simply dismiss psychopaths as monsters. They are human beings with human needs and human potential, and they deserve our understanding not as an excuse for their behavior, but as a starting point for preventing harm. So how do we deal with psychopathy? The answer is not simple. We cannot cure it. There is no medication or therapy that can restore empathy in someone who has never had it. We cannot simply lock away everyone who scores high on the Hare checklist. That would be a violation of basic human rights, and it would also be ineffective since most psychopaths never commit violent crimes. What we can do is three things. First, we can recognize the signs. Psychopaths are often charming, persuasive, and charismatic. They can be difficult to spot, but there are warning signs, a pattern of manipulation, a lack of genuine emotional connection, a tendency to exploit others, a disregard for rules and consequences, a grandiose sense of self-worth. If we are aware of these signs, we can protect ourselves and others from exploitation. Second, we can build institutions that do not reward psychopathic behavior. Many of our institutions, particularly in business and politics, actually select for psychopathic traits. They reward ruthlessness, charisma, and a willingness to bend the rules. We can design institutions that instead reward cooperation, transparency, and accountability. We can create systems of checks and balances that make it harder for the callous and manipulative to rise to positions of power. Third, we can invest in prevention, secure attachment, loving families, supportive communities. These are the conditions that build conscience, even in those who are genetically vulnerable. If we want to reduce the harm caused by psychopathy, we must invest in the conditions that prevent it from becoming destructive. And yet, I must acknowledge the limits of this approach. There are some individuals who are so deeply damaged, so profoundly lacking in empathy, that they pose a genuine danger to others. They cannot be trusted. They cannot be rehabilitated. They must be contained not out of revenge, but out of the simple necessity of protecting the innocent. This is a hard truth. It is uncomfortable. It challenges our belief in redemption and our faith in human goodness. But it is a truth that we must face if we are to be honest about the psychology of evil. Chapter 6. The Narcissist and the Sadist. Psychopathy is not the only face of darkness. There are others equally unsettling, equally destructive, and far more common. Two of them deserve our attention: narcissism and sadism. They are distinct from psychopathy and from each other, but they share a common thread, a profound distortion of the relationship between self and other. And understanding them is essential if we are to grasp the full spectrum of human cruelty. Let us begin with narcissism. The word comes from Greek mythology, from the story of Narcissus, a young man who fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away gazing at it. The myth captures something essential about the condition, a self so captivated by itself that it cannot see anything else. In clinical terms, narcissism is characterized by grandiosity, a sense of entitlement, a need for admiration, and a profound lack of empathy. But unlike the psychopath, the narcissist is not cold and calculating. They are desperate. They crave validation. They need to be seen as special, exceptional, above the ordinary rules that bind the rest of us. Behind the grandiosity lies a fragile self-esteem, a self that is utterly dependent on external approval. The narcissist is not truly self-loving. They are self-obsessed, and their obsession is driven by a deep, unacknowledged fear of being ordinary, of being invisible, of being nothing. This is why narcissists can be so dangerous. When their self-image is threatened, when they are criticized, ignored, or humiliated, they lash out. They devalue others. They engage in behaviors that are cruel, vindictive, and deeply destructive. They do not see others as people. They see them as mirrors, objects that exist to reflect their greatness, and that must be smashed if they fail to do so. Let me give you an example. In the workplace, the narcissistic boss is a familiar figure. They take credit for the work of others. They dismiss feedback. They surround themselves with sycophants and punish anyone who challenges them. They create a culture of fear and flattery in which the only value is loyalty to their image. In relationships, the narcissistic partner is similarly destructive. They demand constant attention and admiration. They dismiss their partner's needs. They gaslight, making the other person feel crazy for questioning their behavior. They alternate between idealization and devaluation, building their partner up only to tear them down. The narcissist does not lack a conscience entirely. They can feel guilt, but it is usually for failing to live up to their own inflated image rather than for harming others. Their moral compass is oriented toward their own needs, and the suffering of others is relevant only insofar as it affects them. This is a subtle form of evil, but it is no less damaging for its subtlety. The narcissist does not commit genocide or start wars usually, but they create environments in which trust erodes, relationships fracture, and human potential is crushed under the weight of their need for validation. Now let us turn to the darkest of all, sadism. Sadism is not just a lack of empathy, it is a pleasure in the suffering of others. The sadist is not indifferent to pain. They are drawn to it. They find satisfaction, excitement, or even sexual gratification in the act of causing harm. Sadism is rare in its clinical form, but elements of it are more common than we like to admit. Think of the schoolyard bully who torments the weaker child for the delight of it. Think of the online troll who derives satisfaction from the distress of strangers. Think of the interrogator who uses the vulnerability of a prisoner as a source of power. Sadism is not a failure of morality. It is a perversion of it, a turning of the moral machinery upside down, so that the suffering of others becomes a reward rather than a punishment. And here is the unsettling truth. Sadism does not always take the form of violent cruelty. It can be subtle, the enjoyment of gossip, the pleasure of watching someone fail, the satisfaction of exercising power over another. These small sadisms are part of everyday life, and they are perhaps the most widespread face of darkness. There is a concept in psychology that captures this: everyday sadism. Researchers have developed a scale to measure everyday sadistic tendencies, the enjoyment of cruel acts that do not rise to the level of clinical pathology. They have found that people who score high on this scale are more likely to enjoy violent video games, to troll others online, and to take pleasure in the misfortunes of those they dislike. This is not a trivial finding. It suggests that sadism is not limited to a small minority of disturbed individuals. It is a dimension of human personality that exists on a spectrum, and many of us are somewhere on it. The question is not whether we have sadistic impulses. We all do at times. The question is whether we indulge them or whether we resist them. This is where the distinction between the three faces of darkness becomes important. The psychopath lacks empathy. They do not care about others, but they do not necessarily take pleasure in their suffering. They are indifferent. The narcissist lacks empathy for others because they are consumed by themselves. They may harm others, but only as a byproduct of their own need for validation. The sadist lacks empathy and takes pleasure in harm. They are not indifferent to suffering. They are attracted to it. These are distinct profiles, but they overlap and interact. A person can be a narcissistic sadist, or a psychopathic narcissist, or a sadistic psychopath. The combinations are many, and the resulting behaviors are varied. What do we do with this knowledge? First, we recognize that these faces of darkness are not rare. They are present in our workplaces, our families, our social circles, and our own minds. We are all capable of narcissism, of sadism, of callousness. The difference between us and them is not a fixed boundary, but a matter of degree. Second, we refuse to demonize. The narcissist, the sadist, the psychopath, they are not monsters. They are human beings who have been shaped by biology, by environment, by choice, and by circumstance. They deserve our understanding, even as we protect ourselves from their harm. Third, we build institutions and cultures that do not reward these traits, but instead discourage them. We create systems of accountability. We model empathy and compassion. We celebrate cooperation over competition. We teach children to recognize and resist their own dark impulses. This is not easy. It requires vigilance and courage. But it is possible, and it is necessary. Chapter 7. The Banality of Evil. Eichmann and the Thoughtless Perpetrator. We have confronted the faces of darkness, the psychopath, the narcissist, the sadist. We have seen how they are wired, how they think, how they harm, and we have felt the chill of recognizing that some people are simply missing something essential. But there is another face of evil, one that is, in many ways, more terrifying than all the others, because it does not belong to monsters. It does not belong to the broken or the deranged. It belongs to ordinary people, people like you and me, people with families, with jobs, with consciences that they believe are intact. And yet, they commit atrocities. They participate in genocide. They turn a blind eye to suffering. They follow orders that lead to unspeakable harm. This is the phenomenon that the political theorist Hannah Arendt captured in a single devastating phrase: the banality of evil. In 1961, Arendt traveled to Jerusalem to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. Eichmann had been captured in Argentina, smuggled to Israel, and put on trial for crimes against humanity. The world expected to see a monster, a sadistic, fanatical anti-Semite who had orchestrated the murder of 6 million Jews with gleeful malice. What they saw instead was something far more disturbing. Eichmann was not a monster. He was, in Arendt's words, terrifyingly normal. He was a bureaucrat, a middle manager of death, a man who had joined the Nazi Party not out of ideological conviction, but because it was a career move. He spoke in clichés, in bureaucratic jargon, in the hollow language of administrative procedure. He did not hate Jews, at least, not in any visceral way. He simply saw them as problems to be solved, as figures on a spreadsheet, as obstacles to the efficient functioning of the system. His defense was simple. He was following orders. He was a cog in a machine. He had no personal animosity toward the victims. He was just doing his job, and Arendt, watching him, was struck by a terrifying thought. This is the face of evil in the modern world, not the fanatic, not the sadist, but the bureaucrat, the man who has stopped thinking. Let me unpack what Arendt meant by this. For Arendt, the banality of evil was not a claim that Eichmann was innocent or that his crimes were trivial. She did not excuse him, she called for his execution. But she argued that his evil was not the result of monstrous intentions or deep-seated hatred. It was the result of thoughtlessness, an inability to see beyond the immediate demands of the job, to question the moral framework within which he was operating, to imagine the human reality behind the paperwork. Eichmann had what Arendt called a lack of imagination. He could not put himself in the place of his victims. He could not see the suffering he was causing. He could not ask the question that might have saved him from himself: what am I doing? This is the terrifying truth at the heart of the banality of evil. You do not need to be a monster to commit monstrous acts. You only need to stop thinking. Now, you might ask, but didn't he know what he was doing? Didn't he know that sending millions of people to their deaths was wrong? The answer is yes. At one level, he knew. He was not insane. He understood the difference between right and wrong, but that knowledge was abstract, intellectual, disconnected from any emotional or moral reality. It was a piece of information, not a guide to action. Eichmann had outsourced his moral reasoning to the system. He had accepted the frame of reference that the Nazi regime provided, and within that frame his actions were not only permissible but necessary. He was not killing people, he was transporting them. He was not participating in genocide. He was solving the Jewish problem. The euphemisms, the bureaucratic language, the diffusion of responsibility, all the mechanisms of moral disengagement we discussed in Chapter 4 had done their work. He had become, in his own mind, an administrator, and administrators do not feel guilt. They feel efficiency. But Eichmann was not an exception. He was a product of a system that rewarded thoughtlessness and punished moral questioning. The Nazi regime was, in many ways, a masterpiece of moral disengagement. It created a system of euphemisms that stripped violence of its emotional content. It diffused responsibility across countless individuals so that no one felt personally accountable. It dehumanized the victims through propaganda, making them seem less than human. It displaced responsibility upward so that orders came from above and compliance was a duty, not a choice. In this system, the question, "What am I doing?" was not just unnecessary, it was actively discouraged. Asking it would have meant recognizing oneself as a moral agent. And moral agency was the one thing the system could not tolerate. This is why the banality of evil is not just a historical observation. It is a warning about the present. Because the same mechanisms that operated in Nazi Germany are operating today in our corporations, our governments, our institutions. The same thoughtlessness, the same diffusion of responsibility, the same euphemistic language, the same bureaucratic indifference. Let me give you a contemporary example. In 2003, American soldiers at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq subjected detainees to humiliating and brutal treatment, forcing them into naked human pyramids, stripping them, placing them on leashes, and in some cases, sexually abusing them. The photographs that emerged shocked the world, but the soldiers who committed these acts were not sadists or psychopaths. They were ordinary young men and women, many of whom had joined the military out of patriotic duty. They had been placed in a situation, a poorly supervised prison, a culture of fear, a command structure that encouraged aggressive interrogation, that eroded their consciences. Their defense was the same as Eichmann's. They were following orders. They were doing what they were told. They did not think about what they were doing. This is the banality of evil in the 21st century, and it is a reminder that the mechanisms of moral disengagement are not relics of the past. They are present, active, and dangerous. So what is the answer? How do we resist the banality of evil? Arendt's answer was simple but profound. Think. Not just in the abstract, but actively to question the frames of reference, to refuse to accept the language of the system, to imagine the humanity of the other, to ask the question that Eichmann could not ask. What am I doing? This is not easy. It is uncomfortable, exhausting, and sometimes dangerous. It means standing apart from the group, questioning authority, refusing to go along with the crowd. It means facing the possibility that you might be wrong, that the system might be corrupt, that the people you trust might be leading you astray. But it is the only defense we have against the banality of evil. Chapter 8. The Cultural Mirror: How Different Civilizations Understand Good and Evil. We have journeyed deep into the individual mind. We have mapped the neural terrain of empathy and cruelty. We have traced the fragile development of conscience. We have confronted the mechanisms that silence it, the faces of darkness that lack it, and the banality of thoughtlessness that allows ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. But there is a dimension we have not yet fully explored, the dimension that contains, shapes, and often amplifies all the others. Culture, human nature, is not a fixed essence. It is not a script written once and for all in our genes or our brains. It is a living, breathing conversation between biology and environment, between the universal and the particular, between what we are given and what we make of ourselves. And culture is the medium of that conversation, the language, the stories, the rituals, the institutions, the values that shape how we understand ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we define the boundaries of good and evil. If we want to understand the psychology of evil, we must understand how different cultures have answered the question of human nature. Because their answers are not merely academic, they are living. They shape how people behave, how societies are organized, and how justice is conceived. Let us begin with the tradition that gave us the very concept of human nature as a moral problem, the West. In the Western tradition, the question of human nature has been haunted by a single powerful idea: original sin. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th century, argued that humanity was fundamentally flawed, that we are born with a predisposition toward evil, a legacy of Adam's fall in the Garden of Eden. This is not just a theological claim. It is a psychological one. It says that evil is not an accident, not a foreign intrusion, but something deeply rooted in who we are. The task of morality, then, is not to discover our innate goodness, but to overcome our innate corruption through grace, through discipline, through the constant struggle against our own nature. This idea has shaped Western civilization in profound ways. It has given us the concept of guilt, the need for confession, the suspicion of human motives, and the belief that institutions, the church, the state, the law, are necessary to restrain our darker impulses. It has also given us a tragic view of history, a sense that the struggle between good and evil is eternal and never fully won. But original sin is not the only Western story. There is another tradition born in the Enlightenment that sees human nature as fundamentally good. Rousseau argued that we are born free and compassionate, and that it is society with its hierarchies, its inequalities, and its corruptions that makes us evil. Locke believed we are born as blank slates, capable of being shaped toward either goodness or evil by education and environment. These two visions, the tragic and the optimistic, have been in tension throughout Western history, and they have shaped everything from our legal systems to our educational philosophies to our foreign policies. Do we see others as potential allies or potential threats? Do we believe in redemption or in punishment? Do we trust the individual or the institution? The answer depends, in part, on which story we have absorbed. Now let us turn east to a tradition that offers a radically different answer to the question of human nature: Confucianism. In the Confucian tradition, human nature is not a fixed essence to be discovered or overcome. It is a potential to be cultivated. Mencius, the great Confucian philosopher, argued that all human beings are born with a sprout of goodness, a natural inclination toward compassion, shame, respect, and the distinction between right and wrong. But that sprout is fragile. It must be nurtured, watered, and protected. Without the right environment, proper education, good role models, harmonious relationships, it will wither. Evil in this view is not original. It is not something we are born with. It is something that happens when the sprout is neglected, when the social order is disrupted, when the rituals and relationships that sustain goodness are broken. This is a profoundly hopeful vision, but it is also a demanding one. It places the responsibility for moral development not just on the individual, but on the community, on the family, the school, the state. If evil exists, it is not simply a failure of the individual. It is a failure of the culture that failed to cultivate them. There is another Eastern tradition that takes this even further: Buddhism. In Buddhism, the question of good and evil is not about a fixed human nature, but about mind, the patterns of thought, desire, and attachment that produce suffering. Evil, in the Buddhist view, arises from ignorance, from the mistaken belief that we are separate, permanent, and self-sufficient selves. When we cling to this illusion, we become greedy, hateful, and deluded. We harm others because we are blind to our interconnectedness. The path to goodness, then, is not about following rules or cultivating virtues in isolation. It is about seeing clearly, about recognizing the nature of reality, and in doing so, letting go of the attachments that lead to cruelty. Goodness is not something we acquire, it is something we uncover by removing the veils of ignorance. This is a psychology of evil that is radically different from the Western one. It does not focus on blame, guilt, or punishment. It focuses on awakening. And it suggests that the most powerful response to evil is not retribution, but compassion, not because evil is excusable, but because it is the product of suffering, and because only by addressing that suffering can we truly end it. But there are also traditions that have emerged from the margins, from the voices that have been silenced by dominant cultures. Indigenous ethics, for example, often conceive of human nature in relational terms. The self is not an isolated individual, but a node in a web of relationships to family, to community, to ancestors, to the land, to the non-human world. Evil, in this view, is not a personal failing. It is a rupture in the web. It is a violation of the sacred bonds that hold life together. This is why many indigenous traditions emphasize restorative justice rather than retributive justice. The goal is not to punish the perpetrator, but to heal the rupture, to restore balance, to repair relationships, to bring the community back into harmony. This is not a soft approach. It can be deeply demanding, but it reflects a different understanding of what evil is and what it requires of us. And then there is the tradition that has shaped much of the modern world, Islamic jurisprudence. In Islam, human nature is seen as created by God with an innate disposition toward goodness, what is called fitra. But that disposition is vulnerable to corruption by environment, by temptation, and by the whisperings of evil. The task of morality is to align the self with God's will, as revealed through scripture and interpreted by scholars. Islamic ethics emphasize both individual responsibility and communal obligation. The individual is accountable for their actions, but the community is responsible for creating conditions that make righteousness possible. Evil is not just a personal failing. It is a social and political problem, requiring both spiritual reform and institutional justice. Now, what do all these traditions have in common? They all recognize that evil is not a simple thing. It is not just a matter of individual pathology or situational pressure or cultural influence. It is all of these things woven together in complex and unpredictable ways, but they also share a common insight. Culture matters. The stories we tell, the rituals we practice, the institutions we build, the values we transmit. These are not mere decorations on the surface of human nature. They are the very fabric of it. They shape what we see, what we feel, what we desire, and what we condemn. They create the conditions in which conscience either flourishes or withers, and this means that we have more power than we might think. If culture can amplify evil, it can also resist it. If institutions can corrupt, they can also protect. If stories can dehumanize, they can also humanize. The same cultural tools that have been used to justify genocide can be used to build movements for justice. The same narratives that have normalized cruelty can be rewritten to celebrate compassion. Chapter 9: The Resistors, Ordinary Heroes. We have spent 8 chapters exploring the architecture of evil. We have seen how ordinary people can be led to commit atrocities, how conscience can be silenced, how culture can normalize cruelty, how the brain can be wired toward callousness. We have confronted the darkness within us and around us, and we have not flinched. But if we stop there, we tell only half the story. Because for every perpetrator, there is a rescuer. For every bystander who looked away, there is someone who stepped forward. For every system that enabled evil, there is an individual who refused to participate. For every moment of moral failure, there is a moment of moral courage. These are the resistors, the people who, in the face of overwhelming pressure, chose to do the right thing. They are not saints, they are not superheroes. They are ordinary human beings who, in a critical moment, found the strength to say no. And their stories are not just inspiring, they are instructive. Because if we want to resist evil, if we want to build a world where evil is less likely to flourish, we need to understand what makes resistance possible. Let us begin with a story that has become emblematic of moral courage, the story of Oskar Schindler. Schindler was a German industrialist, a member of the Nazi Party, a man who profited from the war. He was not a hero by any conventional measure. He was a womanizer, a gambler, a man of questionable ethics. And yet, when he saw the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto, something shifted in him. He began to protect his Jewish workers, bribing officials, falsifying documents, risking his life to save over 1,000 people from the gas chambers. Schindler's transformation was not sudden. It was gradual, a slow dawning of conscience, a growing recognition that the system he had benefited from was monstrous. He did not start as a resistor. He became one, through a series of small choices that accumulated into something extraordinary. This is the first lesson of resistance. It does not require perfection. You do not need to be a saint to do the right thing. You only need to be willing to change, to see, to act, even imperfectly, even haltingly, even late. But Schindler is not the only model of resistance. There are others, quieter and less celebrated, whose stories are equally important. Consider the rescuers of Jews in Nazi Europe. Historians have documented thousands of individuals who risked their lives to hide, shelter, or transport Jews to safety. These were not political activists or trained rescuers. They were farmers, housewives, shopkeepers, priests, ordinary people who, when faced with the choice between complicity and courage, chose courage. What made them different? Psychologists who studied these rescuers found that they shared certain characteristics. They had strong moral convictions, often rooted in religious faith or family values. They had a deep sense of connection to others, a willingness to see beyond the categories of us and them. They were independent thinkers, not easily swayed by group pressure, and they had a capacity for empathy that enabled them to recognize the humanity of those who were being persecuted. But perhaps the most important factor was this: they had been raised to believe that their actions mattered. They had internalized a sense of personal responsibility, a conviction that they could make a difference, that their choices had consequences, that they were accountable not just to the authorities, but to their own consciences. And then there are the resistors who did not just help others, but actively opposed the system itself. Consider Sophie Scholl, a young German student who, with her brother Hans and a small group of friends, formed the White Rose resistance movement. They distributed leaflets calling for opposition to the Nazi regime, urging Germans to wake up to the crimes being committed in their name. They were caught, tried, and executed by guillotine. Sophie was 21 years old. She was not a political revolutionary. She was a student, a young woman with a passion for philosophy and a deep religious faith. But she could not remain silent. She wrote in one of her final letters, "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." These are the resistors of the second kind, the ones who do not just refuse to participate, but actively speak out, who risk everything to tell the truth, who understand that silence is not neutrality but complicity. Now, here is a question that many people ask. What allows some people to resist while others comply? Is it something innate, a genetic predisposition toward courage or compassion? Or is it something learned, a product of upbringing, education, and experience? The evidence suggests that it is both. Some people may have a temperament that makes resistance easier, a lower sensitivity to social pressure, a stronger sense of personal autonomy, a higher level of emotional regulation. But temperament is not destiny. The circumstances that foster resistance are also powerful. Research has identified several factors that increase the likelihood of moral courage. 1. A strong moral identity. People who see themselves as moral beings who define their self-worth in terms of integrity and compassion are more likely to resist pressure to act against their values. They have internalized their morality so deeply that violating it feels like a violation of their very selves. 2. A history of support. Resistors often have a network of allies, family members, friends, mentors who reinforce their values and provide emotional support. They are not alone. They have people who believe in them, who encourage them, who remind them of who they are. 3. A sense of efficacy. People who believe they can make a difference are more likely to act. This is not naive optimism. It is a practical conviction that their efforts matter. Resistors do not wait for certainty. They act despite uncertainty. 4. Perspective taking. Resistors are able to imagine the world from the perspective of others. They see the humanity in those who are suffering, and they feel a visceral pull to respond. This is not intellectual abstraction. It is emotional connection. 5. A willingness to face discomfort. Resistance is rarely comfortable. It involves conflict, risk, and the possibility of failure. Resistors are willing to endure discomfort because they believe that the cost of inaction is higher. But here is the crucial point. Resistance can be cultivated. It is not a fixed trait that some people have and others lack. It is a muscle that can be strengthened through practice, through education, through the deliberate cultivation of empathy and courage. This is why stories of resistance are so important, not because they are inspiring, but because they are instructional. They show us what is possible. They give us models to emulate. They demonstrate that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. This is also why institutions matter. Schools that teach moral reasoning, families that model compassion, communities that celebrate courage, these are not just nice things to have. They are essential to building a culture of resistance. They create the conditions in which people develop the strength to say no. Chapter 10. Can we change? Neuroplasticity and moral growth. We have traveled far, from the basement of Stanford to the neural circuits of empathy, from the fragile forging of conscience to the mechanisms that silence it, from the faces of darkness to the banality of bureaucratic evil, from the wisdom of ancient traditions to the courage of ordinary resistors. And throughout this journey, a question has been lurking beneath every chapter, every story, every insight. Can we change? Can a person who has done terrible things become good? Can a person who lacks empathy develop it? Can a society that has normalized cruelty learn to value compassion? Or are we, once formed, once corrupted, once broken, forever condemned to repeat our patterns? This is not an abstract question. It is the most personal and urgent question of all. Because if we cannot change, then the psychology of evil is a tragedy without redemption, a story that ends in despair. But if we can change, then everything we have explored so far becomes not a verdict, but a map, a map that shows us where we are and points the way toward where we might go. Let us begin with the most hopeful discovery of modern neuroscience: neuroplasticity. For most of human history, the brain was thought to be fixed. Once you reached adulthood, your neural architecture was set. You could learn new facts, but you could not change the fundamental wiring of your mind. The brain was like a computer with a permanent operating system, upgradable in software, but not in hardware. We now know that this is wrong. The brain is not fixed. It changes in response to experience. Every thought, every action, every emotion leaves a trace, strengthening some neural pathways and weakening others. This is what we call neuroplasticity, and it is one of the most important discoveries in the history of science. What this means is that the brain's moral circuitry is not permanent. The circuits of empathy can be strengthened. The circuits of self-control can be reinforced. The patterns that lead to cruelty can be weakened. The brain is not a destiny, it is a practice. Let me give you a concrete example. In one study, researchers scanned the brains of long-term meditators, people who had spent thousands of hours cultivating compassion and mindfulness. They found that these individuals had significantly larger amygdala responses to the suffering of others, and significantly stronger connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. In other words, their brains were more responsive to empathy and better at regulating it. But here is the crucial point. These changes were not innate. They were practiced. The meditators had not been born with these enhanced circuits. They had built them over years of intentional effort through the simple act of directing their attention in a particular way. This is not magic. It is biology. The brain changes in response to what we do with it. And this means that moral development is not a one-time event in childhood. It is a lifelong process shaped by the choices we make every day. Now, this raises a difficult question. If we can change, why do so many people fail to? The answer is that change is not easy. It is not a switch that can be flipped. It is a slow, arduous process that requires sustained effort, supportive environments, and often the help of others. Consider the psychology of addiction. We know that addiction is a brain disease. It rewires the reward circuits, making it incredibly difficult to resist the pull of the substance or behavior. But we also know that people do recover. They recover through a combination of willpower, social support, therapy, and sometimes profound personal transformation. They change their brains through the practices of recovery, and those changes are real. Moral transformation is not fundamentally different. It requires the same elements: awareness, effort, support, and time. It requires the willingness to face the parts of ourselves we would rather ignore, and the courage to build new habits in the face of old patterns. But here is the question that makes this whole inquiry urgent. Can even the most damaged people change? Can those who have committed terrible acts be redeemed? There is no simple answer to this question. In one sense, the answer is yes. There are documented cases of former gang members becoming community leaders, of soldiers with PTSD finding peace, of perpetrators of violence finding remorse, and dedicating their lives to making amends. These are not fairy tales. They are real human stories, and they offer genuine hope. But in another sense, the answer is no, or at least not fully. Some patterns are so deeply ingrained, some traumas so severe, some neural pathways so entrenched that they may never be fully healed. We are not infinitely malleable. We are shaped by genetics, by early experience, by the cumulative weight of our choices. And for some people, change may be impossible without the kind of intensive, sustained intervention that is rarely available. This is why we must hold two truths together. First, change is possible. No one is condemned to remain as they are. The brain's plasticity, the power of practice, the capacity for insight and growth, These are real, and they offer a genuine path toward transformation. Second, change is difficult. It is not guaranteed. It requires conditions that many people do not have access to. It requires a willingness to face pain, to take responsibility, to do the long, slow work of rebuilding a self. So what does this mean for the question of evil? It means that we must resist two extremes. The first is determinism, the belief that people are fixed, that their nature cannot change, that evil is an unalterable fact. This belief is not only scientifically false, it is morally dangerous. It leads to despair, to cruelty, to the abandonment of those who might otherwise be saved. It is the belief that underpins the prison system's focus on punishment rather than rehabilitation, the stigma that attaches to former offenders, the hopelessness that pervades communities trapped in cycles of violence. The second is naive optimism, the belief that everyone can change, that all it takes is the right words, the right therapy, the right environment. This belief is also dangerous. It ignores the reality of deep-seated patterns, the limits of intervention, the genuine risk that some people pose to others. It can lead to the release of dangerous individuals, the minimization of victims' suffering, and a failure to protect those who are vulnerable. The truth lies between these extremes. We must believe in the possibility of change while recognizing its limits. We must offer redemption to those who seek it, while protecting others from those who do not. We must hold hope and caution together in a tension that is uncomfortable but necessary. Chapter 11. Living with the Question: A Guide to Moral Courage. We have come to the end of our journey, though, as you will see, it is not really an end. It is a beginning. We have walked through the darkness together. We have seen the basement of Stanford, the neural circuits of empathy, the fragile forging of conscience, the mechanisms that silence it, the faces of those who lack it, the banality of bureaucratic cruelty, the cultural forces that shape it, the courage of those who resist, and the possibility of change. We have confronted the question that haunted us at the start. What makes a person do evil? And we have found that the answer is not simple. It is not a single cause, but a constellation of causes: biology, psychology, situation, culture, history, choice. It is not a foreign invader, but a possibility within each of us. It is not a fixed essence, but a dynamic interplay of forces that can tip us toward cruelty or toward compassion. But now we must face the question that follows, the question that is perhaps even more difficult, even more urgent. How do we live with this knowledge? There is a temptation when we learn about the psychology of evil to fall into despair, to look at the evidence, the Milgram experiments, the Stanford prison, the genocide, the torture, the everyday cruelties that pervade human life, and conclude that we are doomed, that evil will always win, that resistance is futile, that the best we can do is to protect ourselves and our loved ones and hope for the best. This is a natural response. It is a protective response. But it is also a dangerous one, because despair is not just a feeling, it is a choice. And it is a choice that serves evil, because despair paralyzes us, silences us, and leaves the field open for those who would do harm. The opposite of despair is not naive optimism. It is not the belief that evil can be eradicated or that human nature can be perfected. The opposite of despair is hope, the conviction that our actions matter, that resistance is possible, that the struggle is worth fighting, even if it is never fully won. So how do we live with the question of evil without being consumed by it or becoming indifferent to it? Let me offer 5 practices, not answers, but ways of living that can help us navigate this terrain. 1. Stay awake. The first practice is the simplest and the most difficult. Pay attention. Evil thrives in thoughtlessness, in the refusal to see, the reluctance to question, the comfort of going along. The antidote is awareness. It is the willingness to look at what is happening around us, to ask the difficult questions, to resist the seduction of easy answers. This means staying informed but not overwhelmed. It means reading the news but also reading history. It means listening to voices that are different from our own, especially those that are marginalized or silenced. It means cultivating the habit of asking, what am I not seeing? What am I avoiding? What am I accepting that I should be questioning? Awareness is not a passive state. It is an active practice, a discipline of attention that must be cultivated daily. 2. Strengthen your conscience. The second practice is to cultivate your moral identity. We have seen that conscience is not a fixed possession. It is a fragile achievement built through attachment, internalization, and sustained practice. And like any muscle, it requires exercise. This means surrounding yourself with people who reinforce your values. It means seeking out stories of moral courage. It means reflecting on your choices, not in a spirit of guilt, but in a spirit of growth. It means asking yourself regularly, who am I becoming? Am I becoming more compassionate or more callous, more courageous or more fearful, more open or more closed? It also means practicing moral reasoning not in the abstract, but in the concrete. When you face a difficult choice, do not simply react. Pause. Consider the alternatives. Think about the people who will be affected. Imagine the long-term consequences, and then choose not because you have to, but because you have decided. 3. Build communities of resistance. The third practice is to find your people. We cannot resist evil alone. The pressure to conform, the fear of isolation, the weight of responsibility, these are too heavy for any individual to bear in isolation. We need others who share our values, who support us, who remind us of who we are and who we want to be. This means building communities of moral solidarity, not just online communities, but real embodied relationships with people we trust. It means joining organizations that align with our values. It means finding mentors and being mentors to others. It means creating spaces where we can be honest about our struggles and our failures without being judged. The rescuers of Jews in Nazi Europe did not act alone. They had networks of allies, often based in churches, families, or small resistance groups. They drew strength from one another, and so must we. 4. Cultivate empathy. The fourth practice is to practice seeing the humanity in others. We have seen that dehumanization is a neural process, a way of turning off the circuits of empathy by categorizing others as them. The antidote is to actively resist this categorization, to seek out encounters with people who are different from us, to listen to their stories, to imagine their experiences. This is not easy. It is uncomfortable. It requires us to confront our own biases, our own fears, our own tendency to stereotype. But it is essential, because empathy is not just a feeling. It is a skill, and it can be cultivated. Practical steps. Read literature from other cultures. Watch films that tell stories from perspectives you do not share. Volunteer with organizations that serve people who are different from you. Travel if you can, and when you cannot, travel through books and conversations. Practice the simple act of looking at another person and thinking, you are like me. You want what I want. You fear what you fear. Your life matters as mine does. 5. Act even imperfectly. The fifth practice is to act. We have seen that moral disengagement often works by diffusing responsibility, by convincing us that our actions do not matter, that the system is too big, that someone else will do it. The antidote is to act even imperfectly, even in small ways. Do not wait for certainty. Do not wait for the perfect moment. Do not wait to be sure that you will succeed. Act now in whatever way you can. Write a letter, make a donation, speak up in a meeting. Apologize to someone you have wronged. Reach out to someone who is suffering. Refuse to go along with something that feels wrong. The small acts matter, they accumulate. They change us and they change the world around us. And even when they seem to fail, they are not wasted. Because every act of resistance strengthens the muscles of resistance. Every act of courage makes the next act of courage more likely. And now, the final question. We have explored the psychology of evil. We have seen how it works, how it flourishes, how it can be resisted. We have learned that evil is not a foreign country, but a possibility within each of us. We have learned that the line between good and evil is not a fixed boundary, but a shifting threshold, and that we are all, at every moment, choosing which side of that threshold we will stand on. So here is the question that I leave with you not as a conclusion, but as an invitation. In the face of all that you have learned, in the face of the darkness within and around you, what will you choose? Will you turn away? Will you go along? Will you tell yourself that it doesn't matter, that you are powerless, that the system is too big to fight? Or will you stay awake, strengthen your conscience, build your community, cultivate your empathy, and act even imperfectly, even fearfully, even in the smallest of ways? The choice is yours. It is always yours, and it is the most important choice you will ever make. Because the psychology of evil is not just a theory. It is a reality that we live with every day. But so is the psychology of goodness, the capacity for compassion, for courage, for resistance, for redemption. And that capacity is not a luxury. It is a responsibility. Epilogue: the choice that never ends. The question of evil does not end with this book. It does not end with any book. It is the question that accompanies us through life, that challenges us in every decision, that haunts us in every moment of weakness, and inspires us in every moment of strength. We will never fully answer it. We will never fully resolve it. We will never fully escape it. But we can learn to live with it. We can learn to ask it honestly, to face it courageously, and to respond to it with compassion and resolve. That is the work of a lifetime. It is the work of being human. And it is work that is never finished. The end.